Welcome to this video on the Vampire Sects from the tabletop role-playing game Vampire: The Masquerade. Vampires are, by and large, solitary creatures, thanks to a certain jealousy over territory, as well as paranoia of those who might threaten their existence. However, some vampires appreciate strength in numbers, and when those numbers become great enough, a group of vampires is no longer a pack, or coterie, or a gang. Unified by a goal, ideology, or common enemy, vampires organize, establish ranks, titles, and purpose, and become sects. Contrary to what some vampires believe, however, there are, or at least were, a lot more divisions in their ranks than just Camarilla and Sabbat. But without further ado, the sects of vampire. The Camarilla. The largest and likely most powerful assembly of vampires on Earth is the secretive organization known as the Camarilla, the word roughly translating to the small chamber, which is fitting as power over the many is exercised by the few, who make few justifications for doing so. The Camarilla claim to be the enforcers of the Dark Father Cain's own laws, the six traditions, and therefore the inheritors of his right to rule and judge all vampires, or kindred, a Camarilla term of art to soften the absolute authority they attempt to exercise. But the Camarilla is a relatively modern invention in vampire history. The sect originated during the Peasants' Revolt of 1378. However, it wasn't just the unwashed agrarian rabble revolting against their lords. It was the childer of then ancient vampire lords who still exercised complete dominion over every vampire they created, and only slightly less over vampires they suffered to exist in their domain. Through pledges of fealty, blood bonds, and naked force, these elders ruled with iron fists. Then some childer began to meet in secret. They realized that, though they were powerless against their own sires, they were not so restrained against other vampire lords. In lonely and secret places, pacts of death and liberation were made. These upstarts, the Anarchs, realized that killing the elders not only freed them from the shackles of the blood bond, but also made them stronger. The most famous of these elder slayers was the Bruja Patricia Bolingbroke, also known as Tyler, who attacked the Ventru Lord Hardestat. In 1435, a very not dead Hardestat invited the mightiest elders of Europe to discuss the Anarch question. His proposal was both very old and very new. He proposed that the elders of every clan join a coalition that could quickly and efficiently deal with the threats that crossed both clans and geography. Paranoia, power, and immortality are a dangerous combination, though, and most elders rejected the ambitious Lord of the Black Cross. Most, but not all. 6 other elders agreed to join Hardestat's coalition. The mighty coterie would later be known as the founders of the Camarilla, and also serve as the organization's first Justicars. Through private meetings, negotiations, and veiled threats, the founders gathered enough support to form subordinate war coteries, which began hunting the Anarchs and their Assamite allies. By 1493, the Anarch revolt was effectively over, and its leaders were forced to meet in the English monastery at Thorns to sue for peace. What emerged from the Convention of Thorns was a document of the same name, taking what was a wartime alliance and converting it into a peacetime governing body with one purpose: to enforce the 6 traditions, especially the first, the Masquerade. Now, despite the whining of various fledglings about an ivory tower, the Camarilla is not a centralized organization. The vampires who rule most large and small domains, are typically referred to as princes, are largely left to their own devices. So long as they uphold the traditions and keep their domains relatively quiet, princes are free to be as despotic or liberal as they like, and to employ as many or as few officials as they might desire or require. A Primogen Council of Elders, or lackeys in some cases, a Seneschal to deal with the tedious administrative matters, or to rule in all but name, a sheriff to keep the peace in the domain and deal with suspects and lawbreakers, a keeper of Elysium to maintain the social calendar of a domain's meeting place, or even a scourge, who is a domain's resident exterminator of undesirables. Most princes rule with at least the tacit approval of the Camarilla, either because they are effective at their job or because dislodging them in favor of another potentate would be too much trouble. Standing above the princes of the world are the Inner Circle, the eldest, most powerful, and allegedly wisest kindred in the Camarilla. Its membership is a complete secret. No one even knows how many of them there are, but they are the policymakers of the entire Camarilla, and when they want a mountain moved, they have the capability to get it out of the way, either in one piece or as rubble. The ones with the task of actually moving said mountains out of their master's way are the Justicars. 7, or maybe 6, powerful vampires, each representing one of the clans which claims membership in the Camarilla. The Justicars have acted as the eyes, ears, and fists of the Inner Circle from its inception. During the 13-year terms, a Justicar is answerable only to the Inner Circle. They are adjudicators, mediators, and when needs be, executioners. They may depose princes, wage war against the Sabbat or other enemies of the Camarilla, and declare kindred to be outlaws, their unlives and blood forfeit to whoever finds them first. Even when a Justicar makes a polite request, few kindred are powerful enough, or foolish enough, to refuse them. But every fist needs fingers, and the Justicar need agents of their own, as, mighty though they might be, they cannot be everywhere their presence might be required. Beneath the Justicars are a contingent of capable kindred known as Archons. Originally there were only 4, though in modern nights every Justicar has their own coterie of these minions. They serve at the pleasure of their particular Justicar, though some Archons have served longer in their roles than the Justicar who first appointed them. Archons wear a variety of hats: diplomats, couriers, investigators, saboteurs, spies, assassins, and bodyguards. Most appreciate the utility of subtlety, usually entering and leaving a domain before a prince is even aware of what the Archon's mission actually was. Taken from the ranks of the Archons are the Alisters, a secret group of kindred who hunt the dangerous vampires who occupy the Red List. The occupation is a perilous one, however they are largely immune from the authority of princes, and even the Justicars, as they are the direct servants of the Inner Circle. The Sabbat. Dancing counter to the Camarilla is the Sabbat, the self-styled Sword of Cain. The Proto-Sabbat were the Anarchs of the First Revolt, who rose against their sires, either in the name of freedom or power. The La Sombra claim credit for being the first clan to overthrow their grandsire at the direction of the young Methuselah Gratiano de Veronese. Gratiano did not even bother to hide his assassination of the antediluvian. Instead, he used it as a banner to rally Cainites of other clans to throw off the tyranny of the elders. Likewise, the fiends of Clan Tzimisce destroyed their antediluvian progenitor under a cabal of anarchs led by Lugoj Bloodbreaker, who attacked his resting place and committed diablerie upon him. But a certain reluctant anarch, Lambach Ruthven, tells the story much differently, not that anyone bothers to listen to him. While nearly every clan had its anarchs, the core of the bulk of the revolt would be the bulk of the Sabbat, clans La Sombra and Tzimisce. But in the end, the Anarch revolt failed. While most of the Anarchs were returned to the status quo, some were not content to meekly slink back to their kennels. These unrepentant Anarchs listened at Thorns to the high-handed rhetoric about the sanctity of the blood and the threat of mortals and grew more enraged by the night. So they decided to tear apart the Masquerade before the ink was even dry on the Convention of Thorns. The Anarchs invaded the nearby town of Silchester, exulting in the Cainite nature and feeding with reckless abandon until they were driven off by the newly minted Camarilla. This would be the first of many Sabbats that terrorized Europe for 50 years, as the Camarilla slowly tightened its grip on Central and Western Europe. By the 16th century, the most senior of the Anarchs came together and decided to coordinate their efforts against the Camarilla and their true masters, the Antediluvians, the cannibalistic grandsires who would seek to devour all Cainites in the final nights. The Sabbat is difficult to categorize, as it encompasses all of the virtues and foibles of its various members. It is simultaneously a band of bloodthirsty monsters, an alliance of sadistic and murderous gangs, a guerrilla army marshaled against the tyranny of the Antediluvians, and an apocalyptic cult that exalts its own inhumanity. Contrary to Camarilla propaganda, however, the Sabbat are not some slavering horde of vampire barbarians, banging at the gate of every Camarilla domain in the world. The Pack is the primary unit of the Sword of Cain, and despite their disdain for mortals, the Sabbat has syncretized its own rites and cultures from mortal religions and subcultures. Most Sabbat attend to their own affairs and those of their pack nightly. A pack is a group of vampires who are bloodbound to one another, through a shared communion known as the Valdery. The Ductus, who acts as both gang leader and tribal chief, leads the pack. They may not be the oldest vampire in the pack, but they are either the most fearsome, the smartest, or the most capable. His second, or partner in some cases, the pack priest, deals with the spiritual needs of the pack, officiating its rites and acting as an advisor to the Ductus. For nomadic packs, this is usually as much Sabbat authority as they will ever encounter. In Sabbat cities, the most powerful members of the sect hold the title of bishop, in mockery of the Catholic Church the La Sombra once held great influence in. A larger city will have several bishops for different locations, who are overseen in turn by an archbishop. Sabbat with authority over large sections of a continent, usually North America, are titled cardinal. And standing precariously atop this roiling mass of vampire power is the regent, who resides in what is effectively the Sabbat's capital, Mexico City. Rituals bind the Sabbat to one another and to their cause, and each one intended to compel a vampire's adherence not only to their pack, but to the wider goals of the sect. From creation rites to ignobilis rite, to auctoritas rite, a Cainite's unlife is bound to rise or fall with the sword of Cain. And the Sabbat can fall in any number of ways. Despite the fetishistic obsession some have with the press gang shovelheads, the Sabbat have nearly as many weapons at their disposal as the Camarilla. Indeed, before any crude mass embracing takes place, the Sabbat will often reconnoiter domains, subvert kindred, undermine the ruling authorities, terrorize some vampires into either hiding or running, and kill those who might be integral to the domain's defense, before a crusade is finally called. The Anarchs. The word anarch barely describes a sect, so much as it does an outlook, an attitude, and occasionally a practice. The very name harkens back to the Anarch Revolt and the wild Cainites who would eventually go on to form the Sabbat. The contemporary Anarchs owe more of their grievances in theory to the writers and thinkers of the Enlightenment than to the oppression of the Camarilla, and that they were entitled to liberty, however they might choose to express it. But mostly, the Anarchs are more defined by what they are against, primarily being told what to do and where to do it, than what they are for, mainly what benefits any particular Anarch at that moment. This particular folly of philosophy first burst into life during the French Revolution of 1789, when mortals sought to overthrow the Ancien regime in France. These neo-anarchs made good use of the French Revolution to hunt down and destroy the then dominant Toreador aristocracy in France. The Anarchs, like their mortal counterparts, however, fell to infighting, consigning their former allies turned counter-revolutionary traitors to the stake, the torch, and the national razor, the guillotine, giving the Toreador enough time to beg the Ventru to once again clean up their messes, which they did in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte. Unfortunately, this would not be the end of the Anarchs' utopian delusions. The next paroxysm of Anarch quote-unquote rule came in the form of the Bourgeois Council, which aided the Bolsheviks in their overthrow of the Russian Republic under the socialist revolutionaries. The bourgeois seemed more interested in dictatorship than proletariat, right down to holding that some vampires were simply more equal than others, meaning themselves, as once they had chased the Ventru, Toreador, and Zamitzi from Russia, they made sure that anyone questioning their rule either disappeared or was sent east, most never to be heard from again. Not content with exacting revolutionary justice on their fellow vampires, they turned their ire on the werewolves of Russia as well, seeking to purge the silver fangs of the old Russian aristocracy and the bone gnawers with whom they jockeyed for power. While the Bourgeois Council never formally identified themselves with the Anarchs, their rhetoric often aligned with the Anarchs fascinated by Marxist theory. The Camarilla, however, considered them Anarchs in all but name and treated them as such. Then, in 1990, the Bourgeois Council disappeared, seemingly overnight. Their destruction was orchestrated by the ultimate force of reaction, a power that had dwelled in the land before it was even called Russia, the Little Grandmother, Baba Yaga. The best-known example of Anarch praxis was the Anarch Free State. The Anarch Free State was born in 1944 following the humiliation of prominent Anarch Jeremy McNeil at the hands of the first and only Prince of Los Angeles, Don Sebastian Juan Dominguez. On December 21st of that year, the Anarchs attacked the city's primogen, putting them to flight or final death. A confederate of McNeil's, Salvador Garcia, claimed to have slain the prince and his retainers in his own haven, irrespective of the lone survivor of the massacre, a Malkavian babbling about a demon with golden hair. The Anarchs raced down the coast to San Diego to liberate it from its Camarilla oppressors before moving north. They got as far as San Jose before they were routed by the Prince of San Francisco, Vannevar Thomas. The Revolutionary Council, which had directed the military activities of the Anarchs' 3-month campaign, quickly set about making itself obsolete, publishing a set of principles for the newly minted Anarch Free State, the Status Perfectus, before dissolving the body completely. Rather than transforming into a vampire utopia, the Free State degenerated into gangster feudalism, right down to calling their territories Baronies. McNeil, of course, refused to rule, or even direct the Anarch Free State in any matter besides war against an external enemy. The Anarch Free State's end came about not because of the strength of said external enemies, but because a number of powerful Anarchs were simply tired of lawlessness and gangsterism pretending to be freedom. Tara Kearney, the Anarch Baron of San Diego, opened her domain to the Camarilla in exchange for being recognized as Prince of said city. This was followed by the famous Prince Slayer Salvador Garcia and the Machiavellian Louis Fortier handing over their baronies in Los Angeles to the Quasian in exchange for the title of ministers in their respective domains of the new promised Mandarinate. This combination of ex-Anarchs and Quasian threw McNeil and his stalwarts out of Los Angeles and effectively ended the Anarch Free State. However, there are still Anarchs, equal parts idealist and opportunist, licking their wounds and always convinced that unlike the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and sometimes their own fellow Anarchs, they know best for all other vampires how to exist, the status perfectus, the perfect state. The Inconnu. As easy as it is to think of all vampires as bloodthirsty predators and eternal schemers, some vampires want no part of the great jihad, the eternal struggle between vampires for power, domain, control, titles, or status. Most vampires are unaware that the Inconnu even exists, and if they are, they have no idea as to what these very old vampires want. Some of them are so old that they can recall the Roman Empire and even older nations, as well as previous attempts to unite all of Cain's children under a single polity, such as the Eternal Senate. For the most part, they simply want to be left alone, to pass through the seemingly endless nights in whatever pursuits or studies amuse them, without having to soothe the egos of every up-jumped ancilla calling themselves prince. It is questionable if the Inconnu can even be properly called a sect at all. The main difference between the Inconnu and simply stubborn old autarchists is that the members of the Inconnu do communicate with each other from time to time, and do seem very interested in preserving the vampire race from destruction. To that end, the Inconnu maintain a secret network of monitors, vampires tasked with observing certain locations or entire clans, and reporting back to the leadership of the Inconnu, the Council of 12 located at Hunadawara Castle in the Carpathians. There are some Inconnu who maintain dual allegiances with one of the other major sects, one of whom is a Camarilla prince in the very heart of Europe. There are also rumors that the Inconnu has a special interest in the unmapped road, Golconda, and the salvation of vampires, as described by the antediluvian Salah. The Ashirra. Vampires, like the mortals they once were, and those they depend upon for sustenance, have faith. Indeed, for some vampires, the question of salvation takes on even more urgency after their embrace than it ever did before. One of the larger communities of faithful vampires is the Ashirra, those who follow Islam. The Ashirra was founded by La Sombra, Suleiman ibn Abdullah, who spent 10 years learning directly from the Prophet Muhammad. Suleiman's own faith grew so much that by the time of Muhammad's death, he was able to enter the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, when the same act would have destroyed other vampires. The Ashirra's belief relies on the Surah al-Jinn, which states that even spirits of evil may be saved on the last day if they submit to Allah. Membership in the Ashirra is open to all vampires regardless of clan or prior sect affiliation. There are even vampires of the followers of Set and the Bali among the faithful, though their admittance had to be judged by a court of scholars, and they had to repent openly of their previous idolatries. The clans best represented among the Ashirra are the La Sombra, the Nosferatu, the Assamites, and the Bruja. Nightly, the Ashirra seek to carry out the tenets of Islam. Some claim that the Ashirra walk a harder road than other believers, whose years are limited before they return to Allah's grace. A vampire, or ghoul, Ghul, not to be confused with the still-living ghoul, must adhere to Islam for centuries until their final death, or the last day, when all stand before Allah to be judged according to the deeds of their lives, or unlives. This is further complicated by the vampire's particular dietary need, blood, which flies directly in the face of the Quran's prohibition against consuming such. Different Muslim vampires have different solutions to this problem, from consistent fasting to ritual purification of the blood they drink, to acts of charity to balance out the transgression they must commit to survive. Suleiman ibn Abdullah continues to serve as mullah of the entire Ashirra Ummah, or community, as the first and most respected ghoul in service to Allah, and one of the few who can walk through the holy cities unhindered by the true faith emanating from those places. The Laibon. The Laibon is the name of the body of vampires who call Africa their home. During the Dark Ages, the kindred of Europe and the Middle East mistakenly believed that the Laibon referred to a single bloodline of vampires, a mistake that the emissaries of the Ebony Kingdom have not taken great pains to correct. The Laibon are not the African Camarilla, though certain similarities do show. The Laibon Magaji, or kings of a given region, vaguely resemble the Camarilla office of prince. Likewise, the Laibon Kolo, or ancestors, whether one or several, hold a similar position of respect to the Camarilla Primogen. Additionally, the legacies, what the Laibon call their various clans, are clearly offshoots of better-known clans of both the Camarilla and the Sabbat, including two, the Malawatu and the Nkulu Zau, are descendants of the Cappadocians and Salubri respectively. The Ebony Kingdom is ruled by approximately 11 Guruhi lords, the Guruhi being the first legacy to arrive in Africa and make it their own. Beneath them are the Magiji, who rule their domains with or without the advice of the Kolo. There are 9 legacies in Africa: the aforementioned Guruhi, who rule the Ebony Kingdom, the Akunansi, the wandering storytellers, the followers of Set, who should need no introduction, the Ishtari, who are spies and information brokers, the Kionyi, who are nomads, mercenaries, and thieves, the Nagloppers, who are shape-changing bush sorcerers and torturers. Wonder who they might have come from. The Osebo, the hot-blooded warrior caste of the Laibon, the Shango, highly civilized and blood-addicted sorcerers, and the Zidundu, the deceptive, ruthless shadowmen of the Congo and East Africa, who seek to usurp the Guruhi. Simply residing in Africa, however, does not make one Laibon. The Laibon do not adhere to the path of humanity, or the paths of enlightenment. Instead, the Laibon morality is twofold: Orun, or heaven, and Aye, or earth. Orun refers to a Laibon's adherence to the cosmic order, the spiritual realms, and their own nature as vampires. Aye deals with how a Laibon interacts with mortal society, particularly if they are good, law-abiding, friendly neighborhood vampires, or if they raise the crime rates and lower the property values of every domain they lair in. The greater a Laibon's Orun, the more unnatural they seem, whether unnaturally appealing or terrifying. Likewise, a Laibon who neglects Orun seems mundane and forgettable, more useful to some than to others. A Laibon with high Aye appears to be more human than monster. The New Promised Mandarinate. The Quasian's great leap outward on the American West Coast was met with multiple reactions among the kindred. For the Anarchs, it was a mixture of panic, fear, and rage. For the Sabbat, the Cathians were a potential threat to be observed from a safe distance. And for the Camarilla, the Cathians were simply the Anarchs finally receiving their just deserts for spurning the protection and guidance of their betters. When the ocean-crossing warriors of the Quasian first descended on the Anarchs in 1998, the kindred were caught off guard and suffered greatly. However, the Anarchs boasted experienced guerrillas, superior terrain knowledge, and the ability to replenish their numbers faster than the Quasian could. From Los Angeles to San Francisco, the Anarchs and Quasian battered each other to bloody pieces. In September 1999, a change of leadership and strategy was carried out by the Quasian. Rather than break the Anarchs, the new mandarins of the Fence Menders faction decided that the Anarchs could be best overcome by the use of divide and rule tactics. They exploited the tensions between Anarch gangs and frustrations with the Anarch leader Jeremy McNeil's outright refusal to, well, lead in any circumstances other than war. The first Anarch of note to go over to the Quasian side was the firebrand Salvador Garcia, who once claimed credit for sending the last Prince of Los Angeles to final death. In exchange for the destruction of the Crypt Sons gang, as well as assistance against the Sabbat, the Quasian effectively sealed the fate of the Anarch Free State. Soon after Garcia went Louis Fortier, who saw the writing on the wall between Tara Kearney's defection to the Camarilla and Garcia's to the Quasian, and as usual, wanted to be on the winning side. Back in China, the mandarins of the Quasian presented their plan as efficiently subordinating the barbaric Qinjin, their name for vampires, conserving resources, and bringing them under Quasian supervision and guidance as a disposable force of shock troops to be turned against the Yama kings. The face they showed the Anarchs was that of an outside mediator, not bogged down by decades of fratricidal rivalries and grievances. During the New Year's riots of 1999, the Quasian and their kindred allies used the opportunity to push the remaining Anarchs out of Los Angeles and San Francisco, either into exile or final death. The year 2000 welcomed the formation of the new promised Mandarinate, built over the corpse of the Anarch Free State. For the former Anarchs, it was a respite from decades of pointless gang warfare in the name of freedom. For the Quasian, it was their beachhead and colony for further expansion into the Americas. For the Sabbat, it was just one more enemy to kill, and for the Camarilla, it was a new player, either to be manipulated or removed from the board. The Baronies of Avalon. For centuries, Mithras, the Ventru Prince of London, was also overlord of most of the British Isles. This arrangement of tribute in gold and blood came to be known as the Baronies of Avalon, a name at least one of its barons found ironic. The arrangement on its face was very simple. The barons gave oaths of loyalty to Mithras, and he would ostensibly protect them. And those barons who shirked their duties might find their domains undermined by Mithras' secret agents among the mortals, magi, or even lupines. But when a harder lesson needed to be taught, Mithras sent his satraps, effectively an army of vampires, ghouls, and mortals, to deal with the offending party. More than anything, the Baronies of Avalon were a political experiment by Mithras to improve upon the feudal arrangement of vassalage and, by extension, the path he walked, known as the Road of Kings. In addition to more martial satraps, strategically located near each baron's domain, were the Knights of Avalon, a force of low-clan vampires. Mithras also secretly maintained his Mithraic cults as further tools of control and secret advancement within mortal and vampire politics. Mithras was once worshipped as a god, and never abandoned that particular conceit. Mithras' main core and court was comprised of those vampires he recognized as his potential heirs, should he ever fall into a long torpor, or worse, final death. Several of these were his childer or grandchilder, but a few, like Roger de Camden of Clan Cappadocian and Athelwulf of Clan Gangrel, were not of the Clan of Kings, but highly favored by Mithras, so much so that the Prince of London would personally avenge their deaths, which are both stories for another day. An interesting point is that the Baronies of Avalon never formally submitted to the authority of the Camarilla. The Baronies of Avalon were officially neutral during the Anarch Revolt, and served as the site of the Convention of Thorns, which marked the revolt's official end. Mithras openly declared that he would never yield to those younger in blood and less wise than himself. Quietly, however, his seneschal, the Cappadocian Roger de Camden, negotiated a treaty with the Camarilla. The founders of the Camarilla did not require Mithras to submit to their rule, nor were they confident they could force the matter upon him. Instead, the treaty between the Baronies and the Camarilla stipulated that the Baronies would modify its blood laws to bring them into line with the Camarilla interpretation of the six traditions. The Baronies would continue in their state of Swiss-like neutrality, largely feuding with one another under Mithras' watchful eye, until he disappeared in 1941 during the Blitz, when his role as Prince of London was taken over by another Ventru, Lady Anne Bowsley. The Children of Osiris. The children of Osiris were born from their namesake's fidelity to humanity, and his disgust with the vampire need for human blood. During Osiris' reign as pharaoh, he barred humans from indulging in cannibalism. But Osiris was not alone. There is some ambiguity concerning whether Osiris sired progeny, either before his first death or at all. However, he had one favorite progeny, either of his blood or philosophy, Kedemon, the grand undying king. Either Osiris or Kedemon created the signature discipline of the children of Osiris, Bardo, a power created to protect and enforce humanity. Those who claim that Bardo came from Osiris say it came about through his great discipline and adherence to Ma'at, or justice. Those who say it was Kedemon claim that he fled Egypt for India following Osiris' second death, where Kedemon learned practices that allowed him to maintain and cultivate his humanity through asceticism and self-abnegation. The children of Osiris are composed entirely of self-exiles from other clans. Following the example of Osiris and the instruction of Kedemon, they do not sire progeny. Despite being largely mythical to most of their kind, the children of Osiris and the power of Bardo cannot be understated. Masters of the discipline are able to restore vampires from final death, as Osiris was once put back together by Isis and Nephthys. Another example of their power is the ability to restore a vampire who has been entirely lost to the beast and become a wight. One of the few things that can lure the children of Osiris from their meditations is the followers of Set. The children have a particular loathing for the Setites and any vampire who willingly succumbs to the beast. The children have proven themselves capable vampire hunters, either by sponsoring proxies to act in their stead or through their use of magic. The sixth great maelstrom compelled the king of Amenti, Osiris, to rise from his throne and save the souls within his domain. As he did, he rose into the living world once more. Osiris summoned his children to him so that they could be judged. During the great conclave, the children of Osiris were all freed from the curse of Cain, one way or another. Those who endured in righteousness, according to the principles of Ma'at, and who denied themselves the blood of mortals, were rewarded with their humanity once again, free to live and die as mortals. Those who were less rigorous in their pursuit of Ma'at and secretly permitted themselves human blood were purged by Osiris' holy flames. The children of Osiris still exist as a group of mortal sorcerers and cultists who aid the mummies created by Osiris' new spell of life in controlling their kybits, their shadow souls, just as they once struggled against the beast. The Tal'Mahe'Ra. Time for a little taste of 2nd edition madness. The Tal'Mahe'Ra, also known as the Manus Nigrum, or the Black Hand, or the True Hand among their own, were a sect predating all others, and, at various points included, vampires, mages, sorcerers, liches, wraiths, revenants, abominations, and even mortals. The goal of this most ancient of all conspiracies was to guide humanity towards the next epoch of direct rule by the antediluvians, and to prepare those vampires outside of the Tal'Mahe'Ra as sacrificial lambs for the grandsires. The Tal'Mahe'Ra were the predecessors of the Euthanatos tradition of mages, who were aware of vampires and made them the subject of their Thanatoic studies. Vampires eventually took over the Tal'Mahe'Ra and grew the organization, albeit in two different directions. The Tal'Mahe'Ra of the West focused on influencing mortal and vampire politics, while the Tal'Mahe'Ra of the East directed their attention to death and the underworld, hewing closest to the original purpose of the sect. It was at this point that the Tal'Mahe'Ra began to direct the world towards the return of the antediluvians and their rule. The Western branch sought to break vampiric control over mortal society by spurring certain young bourgeois, La Sombra and Tzimisce, against their elders, as well as encouraging their pawns in the church to direct resources towards the hunting of vampires. Instead, the Anarch revolt gave birth to the Camarilla and the Sabbat. But to their pleasant surprise, the Tal'Mahe'Ra managed to successfully infiltrate both sects and began to play them against each other. The greatest locus of their influence was within the Black Hand, which the Tal'Mahe'Ra took to calling the False Hand, as opposed to themselves as the True Hand. The Tal'Mahe'Ra, however, never controlled the Camarilla or the Sabbat outright. They did, however, hold enough influence to keep them in a state of constant war against each other, mainly in the form of throwing Sabbat headfirst against the Camarilla whenever possible. In the 17th century, the eastern branch of the Tal'Mahe'Ra lost control of Enoch, its base of operations in the underworld, to the Death Lords of Stygia. Just a century later, the western and eastern branches reunited to take back the city and the underworld, placing it under the dominion of a vampire known as the Del Rho, henceforth leader of the entire sect. In the final nights, the True Hand worked to exacerbate the tensions between the Sabbat, Camarilla, and the independent clans. In addition to controlling the Black Hand of the Sabbat, the Tal'Mahe'Ra counted around a dozen Camarilla princes and even a Justicar among their numbers. The Tal'Mahe'Ra was also involved in an operation they called the Shadow Crusade, a war against those it believed were infected by vicissitude, a sentient disease that transformed its victims into flesh-twisted alien monstrosities the sect called Soul Eaters. Enoch, and by extension the Tal'Mahe'Ra, met their mutual end thanks to the schemes of several ancient ghosts and the use of a relic nuclear weapon on Enoch. This attack wiped out the Tal'Mahe'Ra's leadership and most of its senior members. The Conspiracy of Isaac. To both transliterate and paraphrase a statement from the French novel The Human Comedy, the secret of a great success for which you are at a loss to account is a crime that has never been found out, because it was properly executed. In the case of the Conspiracy of Isaac, it was a crime that was both found out and only partially executed. At the heart of the conspiracy was the ancient alliance between clans Ventru and Cappadocian. In the Baronies of Avalon, the relationship was strong, as evidenced by the trust between Prince Mithras and his seneschal, Roger de Camden. Elsewhere, the alliance frayed as the Cappadocians, under the leadership of Japheth, turned their eyes towards heaven and neglected their responsibilities to the Ventru. One ambitious Ventru, Lady Jadwiga Almanov of Bohemia, believed it would be most efficient to simply remove Japheth from the equation. And who would replace Japheth as the right hand of the father, Ashirra called Cappadocius? His newest child, the shrewd, wealthy, materialistic, and very power-hungry merchant necromancer, Augustus Giovanni. Lady Jadwiga believed that Augustus and his son Claudius would be useful puppets that she could threaten to expose to Cappadocius if they refused her. But unbeknownst to Lady Jadwiga and Clan Ventru, the Giovanni family did not mean to serve Cappadocius long. They were planning a hostile takeover of the Clan of Death before Augustus was ever embraced. So, with this treacherous alliance formed, Lady Jadwiga and Claudius Giovanni brought in other conspirators, one from each clan, and all hedonistic aristocrats like themselves, who could be bent with the promises of a share of Japheth's vitae, as well as other considerations. But another group of vampires learned of the conspiracy against Japheth and sought to stop it, and in doing so, hoped to gain the goodwill of Cappadocius. These 7 elders would become legendary in the preceding years as the victors in the Anarch Revolt and the founders of the Camarilla. In 1444, the Conspiracy of Isaac collided with the founders at the monastery of St. Timothy. Though the conspiracy was broken in battle, the founders of the Camarilla failed in their mission, as both Japheth and Cappadocius himself were slain and diablerized by both Claudius and Augustus Giovanni respectively, beginning the second purge of a vampire clan by a usurper. But had history been perhaps 1 inch different that night, it might be the Conspiracy of Isaac that ruled over all vampires in Cain's name, rather than the Camarilla. The Trinity. There once was a dream called Constantinople. It was a dream shared by 2, the mortal, Flavius Valerius Constantius, and the Toreador Methuselah, Michael. But the dream spread, from Constantine to the short-lived dynasty he would found out of the chaos of Diocletian's tetrarchy, and from Michael to his 2 lovers, Antonius the Gaul of Clan Ventru and the Draken of Clan Zimitzi. The 3 Methuselahs observed as Constantine reformed his empire and built his new Rome on the Bosphorus. And when the great emperor died, the 3 Methuselahs who had abandoned the old Rome in favor of the new met in council to determine the fate of Constantinople. When the Triumvirate, as they were later known, decided that the Western Roman Empire would remain Christian in honor of Constantine. A century later, the Triumvirate met once again in the Second Council to address the matters of mortal and vampire refugees created by the fall of Rome. It was decided that only the Triumvirate and their broods would be permitted to dwell in Constantinople, and each family would govern a section of Byzantine society. Michael, its culture and aristocracy, Antonius, the government and bureaucracy, and the Draken, its burgeoning monastic orders. Exceptions were made for those considered to be scions, essentially adoptees of one of the three families. The first of these scions was the Lasombra cleric Magnus, the Cappadocian doctor Alexia Theusa, and the Bruja jurist Trebonius. In time, the Triumvirate became known as the Trinity, with Michael acting as the Father, Antonius as the Son, and the Draken as the Holy Spirit. However, unlike the harmonious Holy Trinity, Michael, for the sake of his vanity, enjoyed playing his lovers against one another to compete for his favor, battles which resulted in fractures within the dream and chaos within the Byzantine Empire, all while Michael's sanity began to buckle under the weight of his own divine purpose. In a fit of pique, Michael and the Draken, in a secret council, authorized Antonius' own childer, Septima and Caius, to assassinate Antonius, their own sire. But Antonius' death drove Michael and the Draken further apart, as they both realized just how deeply they had cared for Antonius, more than they did for political power, but by then it was too late. In time, the Draken abandoned Constantinople and Michael. Michael, now surrounded by grasping sycophants, schemers, and his own delusions of godhood, stood by while his dream slowly crumbled in hands too weak to protect it. In 1204, the dream truly and finally died as the Fourth Crusade, the handiwork of those Michael had once named Incognitus, sacked Constantinople, and the dreamer himself met his end under the fangs of the Bali, Mary the Black. The Eternal Senate. In the shadow of the Roman Republic, the Ventru Colat, then Prince of Rome, realized that no one vampire could rule a city like Rome alone, and certainly not Rome as he envisioned it, as an empire. Rather than demand unswerving obedience from the Cainites around him, he invited the most venerable elder vampires to come and assist him in ruling, an eternal senate modeled after the Roman Senate. Colat's eternal senate included a representative from each clan in the Republic and later the Empire. His manner of electing senators was simple. Each Cainite could vote for a prospective senator, save the candidate himself. The votes of the candidate's clan would count for two, thus tipping the scales in favor of the clan to be represented, while being mindful of the interests of other clans. The election process meant that every senator was constantly jockeying with their fellow senators for power while guarding their own positions, which left Colat, the eternal consul of the Eternal Senate, largely free to rule as he wished, and his Eternal Senate filled with respectable yet pliable compromise candidates who threatened no one who actually mattered. He even sweetened the deal by granting the Senate the power to overrule his decrees by a unanimous vote, something that he knew, and never actually did, happen. The Eternal Senate would endure even after the mysterious disappearance of Colat, and his child, Camilla, rose to claim his position as Prince of Rome and Pater Patria. Yet Camilla did not solicit the Eternal Senate for their advice as his sire once had. Preferring to speak with the powerful in private and arranging his own secret network of power and favors, the Eternal Senate slowly withdrew into itself until one of its more august members, the Toreador Michael, abandoned Rome in favor of Constantinople, declaring that the Eternal Senate had hidden themselves so deeply as to become incognitus, unknown, and so the Eternal Senate disappeared completely from history, though some suspect that their hand continued to be felt, long after Rome ceased to be the great power binding the known world together. And those were the sects of Vampire the Masquerade. One question that has popped up several times is, why isn't the game Bloodlines canon? Well, kids, you see, for Bloodlines to be canon, these three books that will appear on screen now have to not exist, which it seems the current regime has made their peace with doing. The Quasian don't just hold Los Angeles, but most of the California coast, which in hindsight may have been a bit more prescient than White Wolves themselves knew at the time. But I suppose the current regime must be sensitive to those who make their Battle Royale spyware, I mean games. Anyway, Having the two big sects makes things neater in some sense, but I like that some vampires, either singly or collectively, are simply too powerful, too distant, or simply too unusual to simply be swept up in the Camarilla or the Sabbat, such as the Laibon, the Baronies of Avalon, or the new promised Mandarinate. And the Tal'Mahe'Ra was an interesting concept, but like some of 2nd edition, there was a bit too much shoehorned into it. There was too much of an effort to make it cross game lines. Now, crossing game lines can work out, but it takes a certain amount of collaboration and maturity from both players and STs to make it work. If they had just been the knowing agents of the antediluvians, the shepherds to the sheep leading the flocks to a grand slaughter of mortal and vampire alike in the end of days, they probably would have been a lot easier to digest as a sect. Someone might have listened and wondered, where are the vampire cults? Well, I decided to leave off the smaller, decentralized, or esoteric types, like the Bahari, for another time. Editorial prerogative. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Until next time.